I didn't realize someone had stolen 6 feet of my land until I pulled into my driveway and felt off. Not wrong in a big, obvious way. Nothing dramatic. Just off. Like when you walk into your own house and something's been moved an inch to the left, and your brain can't quite name it, but your gut knows. And then I saw it. My fence line wasn't straight anymore. Now I've lived on that piece of land just outside Millbrook County most of my life. My dad bought it back in the early 90s. 3 acres on a quiet corner where the road bends just enough that you don't get much traffic. And for years it was just us, a couple barns, a workshop, and enough open space that you could breathe without hearing someone else's business through the walls. So when I say I know that fence line, I know it like muscle memory. I've walked it, repaired it, leaned against it more times than I can count. But that day, I stepped out of my truck and just stood there for a second, squinting, because something wasn't lining up. The mailbox looked closer to the driveway. The gravel strip along the edge seemed tighter. And the fence, it angled ever so slightly inward like it had been nudged. I remember thinking maybe I was just tired. Long day at work, head still buzzing. But then I started walking the line. And about halfway down, I stopped cold. Because those weren't my fence posts. They were brand new. Fresh wood, clean cuts, still smelling like lumber, set into bright concrete that hadn't even had time to weather yet. And my old fence, the one my dad and I put up together years ago, was gone. Not destroyed. Not scattered. Just pulled out and stacked neatly on my side like someone had decided it was junk they'd deal with later. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, trying to make sense of how something like this even happens. No phone call. No knock. No note. Nothing. Just a small plastic sign zip-tied to one of the new posts, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I walked over and pulled it closer. Boundary adjusted per regional development alignment. I actually laughed when I read that, not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous it didn't feel real. Regional development. That's when it clicked. About a year earlier, a development company had bought up the farmland bordering my property and started building one of those high-end subdivisions. You know the type? Stone entrance, curated landscaping, little artificial creek running through the front like they're trying to convince people they're living in some mountain retreat. They called it Pine Hollow Reserve. There isn't a pine tree within 10 miles of that place. Just rows of tightly packed houses with identical mailboxes and driveways that look like they were stamped out of the same mold. And apparently my land had become inconvenient for their alignment. I didn't even bother going inside. I got back in my truck and drove straight down to the subdivision entrance. And I'll give them this, they spared no expense. Big stone walls on either side, name carved deep into polished granite, soft lighting tucked into the base so it glowed at night, and this little waterfall feature trickling behind it like it was some luxury resort. It looked expensive. It looked intentional. It looked like something someone cared about. And as I stood there, looking at it, something in the back of my mind started to itch. Because I remembered a conversation. I must have been in my early 20s. My dad was still around then, sitting out on the porch with a man in a button-down shirt who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. That guy had been part of the original development team. He'd asked my dad for permission to place the entrance sign slightly over our property line, said it would only be temporary, just until they finalized their layout. No paperwork, no contracts, just a handshake. And my dad, being who he was, had agreed. Because back then, people still believed a handshake meant something. I remember asking him later why he didn't get it in writing. He just shrugged and said, if a man needs paper to keep his word, he wasn't planning to keep it anyway. Standing there now, staring at that entrance, I realized something important. That sign, that entire structure, wasn't fully on their land. It was on mine. And suddenly, that 6 feet they took from me didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt deliberate. I turned around, got back in my truck, and headed straight for the HOA office. Because if someone was going to explain this, it was going to be them. And I had a feeling they weren't expecting me to ask. The HOA office sat right near the entrance, tucked into one of those polished little buildings that tries to look welcoming, but somehow still feels like you're about to get fined for breathing wrong. I parked out front, killed the engine, and just sat there for a second, hands on the wheel, replaying everything in my head. Because part of me still hoped there was some explanation that made this less insane. Then I stepped out and walked in. Inside, it smelled like fresh paint and expensive air freshener. Everything was clean, staged, like no one actually lived in that space. They just maintained it. There was a woman at the front desk, mid-30s maybe, perfect posture, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge of property decisions around here." She hesitated just long enough to be noticeable, then said, "That would be Mr. Caldwell." Of course it would. She made a quick call, then gestured down the hall. "Second door on the left." I knocked once and stepped in. And there he was. Ethan Caldwell, HOA president, developer liaison. The kind of guy who always looks like he's halfway through closing a deal even when he's just sitting at his desk. He stood up with a smile like we were old friends. "Well, you must be Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "I was wondering when you'd stop by. That right there, that told me everything." I didn't take his hand. "You moved my fence." He didn't flinch, just slowly lowered his hand and leaned back against his desk, calm as anything. "We adjusted the boundary line," he said, "based on updated survey data." "You didn't adjust anything," I said. "You took 6 feet of my land." He gave a small, almost amused exhale, like I was being dramatic. "It's a minor shift," he said, "and frankly, it improves the visual flow of the community entrance." I just stared at him for a second. Visual flow. "Daniel," he continued, now using that tone people use when they think they're being reasonable, "this development is bringing significant value to the area. Property values are increasing, infrastructure is improving. We assumed that I wouldn't mind." I cut in. He smiled again. Exactly. That smile. That was the moment something in me locked into place. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. They looked at my land, decided it didn't fit their picture, and moved it. Like I wasn't even part of the equation. I took a step closer to his desk. "Let me ask you something," I said. "That entrance out there, the stone sign, the walls, the lights, you know where that sits, right?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched me. And that tiny pause, that was all I needed. "You do know?" I said. "It's within the development boundary," he replied carefully. "No," I said. "It's not." Silence stretched between us for a second. Then he straightened slightly, the smile fading just a bit. "If you have documentation to support that," he said, "you're welcome to submit it through the proper channels." There it was. Polite, dismissive, calculated. I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "I think I will." And then I turned and walked out. Now here's the thing. I'm not a lawyer. I don't throw around legal threats. I don't like dragging things out. But I do know how to follow a trail when something doesn't sit right. And this didn't sit right at all. So I drove straight to the county records office. If you've never been to one, it's not exactly exciting. Rows of old files, maps, documents that feel like they've been sitting there longer than anyone remembers. But buried in all that is the truth. I spent the next couple hours digging, pulling old plats, original land surveys, property records dating back decades. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture came together. The original boundary line hadn't changed, not even close. And more importantly, there was no recorded easement for that entrance. No agreement. No transfer of rights. Nothing. Just like I remembered. A handshake, which, legally speaking, means nothing. I leaned back in that chair and just sat there for a moment, staring at the documents spread out in front of me. Because now it wasn't just about the fence. It was about intent. They didn't misread anything. They knew exactly what they were doing. They took 6 feet from me because they thought I wouldn't push back. And the only reason that entrance existed where it did was because my father had trusted someone who clearly didn't deserve it. I gathered up copies of everything. Stamped, verified, official. Then I drove over to a small legal office downtown. A guy named Marcus Bell, someone my neighbor had recommended years ago when we had a minor property dispute over a drainage line. Marcus wasn't flashy. No big firm, no fancy branding. Just a quiet office, stacks of files, and a man who listened more than he talked. I laid everything out for him. The fence, the sign, the conversation. He didn't interrupt once. Just flipped through the documents slowly, occasionally nodding. Finally, he looked up at me. "They overstepped," he said plainly. "Yeah," I replied. "I figured." He tapped one of the maps. "This entrance, it's definitely on your property. And without an easement, they have no legal right to maintain a permanent structure there." I let that sink in. "So what are my options?" He leaned back slightly. "You could file a formal dispute, push for removal, potentially pursue damages for the encroachment." I shook my head. "How long would that take?" He gave a small shrug. Months. Maybe longer. That's what I thought. And the thing is, I didn't want months. I wanted clarity. I wanted balance. So what's the fastest option? I asked. Marcus studied me for a moment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person I was. Then he said, you can revoke permission. Permission? If there was never a formal agreement, he explained, then their use of your land is technically permissive, which means you can withdraw that permission at any time. And then what? Then they're occupying your property without authorization. I felt something shift in my chest when he said that. Because suddenly, this wasn't complicated anymore. It was simple. They took something from me. And sitting right there on my land was something they cared about a whole lot more. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. Let's do that. Marcus helped me draft the notice. Clean. Direct. No emotion. Just facts. By the time I left his office, it was already late afternoon. I drove straight back to the county office and filed it. Stamped. Recorded. Official. And as I walked back to my truck, I felt this strange calm settle over me. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just certainty. Because for the first time since I saw that fence, I knew exactly how this was going to play out. They thought they could move my boundary like it didn't matter. They thought I'd just accept it, adjust, fall in line with their version of how things should be. But what they didn't realize was that their entire front door sat on land they didn't own. And by the next morning, that was going to become a very real problem. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried, but because my mind kept running through what the next day was going to look like. Every possible reaction, every possible outcome. The kind of restless thinking you get when you know something's about to shift, and there's no stopping it. By 6:30 the next morning, I was already up, coffee in hand, standing out by the edge of my property where the subdivision entrance sat like it had every right to be there. It looked the same as always, polished stone, soft water trickling down the artificial falls, lights still glowing faint from the night before. Peaceful, put together, like nothing was about to change. At 7:15, the first truck rolled in. Then another. Flatbeds, equipment trailers, a small excavation crew. Nothing flashy, just working men showing up to do a job. One of them stepped out, clipboard in hand, glanced at me, and gave a short nod. You the owner? Yeah, I said. He handed me the work order, already signed and stamped. Clear instructions. Remove all non-permitted structures within designated boundary. No confusion. No gray area. I signed where I needed to, handed it back, and stepped aside. All right, he said, turning to his crew. Let's get to it. And just like that, it started. There's something surreal about watching a place lose its identity piece by piece. First, they shut off the water feature. That soft, constant trickle, gone in an instant. Then came the lights, wiring pulled, fixtures removed, set aside like decorations after a holiday. And then the stone. Each slab that made up that grand entrance, carefully lifted, hauled off, stacked onto trucks like it was nothing more than leftover material from a job site. No ceremony, no hesitation, just steady, methodical work. By around 9 a.m., people started noticing. Cars slowed as they approached, drivers squinting like they couldn't quite process what they were seeing. Some pulled over. A couple stepped out, phones already in hand. One woman in a yoga outfit walked straight up to me. What is happening? She asked, eyes wide. Property correction, I said simply. She blinked. They can't, I said. That's why they're not. She didn't know what to say to that. By 10:00, the first real reaction hit. Ethan Caldwell's black SUV came flying down the road, tires crunching gravel as he pulled up hard near the site. He stepped out fast, no smile this time. What the hell is this? He demanded, striding toward me. I stayed where I was. You tell me, I said. He gestured wildly at the crew. You can't just tear down the entrance. That's community property. I reached into my folder, pulled out the documents, and handed them to him. It's not, I said. It's mine. He barely glanced at them before shoving them back toward me. This is absurd. We have plans, approvals. Do you have an easement? I asked. That stopped him, just for a second. And in that second, everything shifted. Because now he wasn't talking. He was thinking. You should have come to me, he said finally, voice tighter now. I did, I replied. Yesterday. His jaw tightened. Around us, the crew kept working. Another section of stone wall came down with a dull, heavy thud. The sound echoed more than it should have. Stop this, he said, stepping closer. We can work something out. I shook my head. You already worked something out, I said. You just didn't include me. For a moment, it looked like he might actually lose his temper. But then he exhaled slowly, straightened his jacket, and shifted gears. All right, he said. Let's be reasonable. That word again. Reasonable. Put everything back the way it was, he continued. And we'll revisit the boundary adjustment. No, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then we'll compensate you. Fairly. No. Now the frustration was showing. Daniel, this is going to create problems you don't want. I glanced past him at the now half-empty entrance, the open space where the sign used to stand. Looks like it already is, I said. And with that, I turned and walked away. By noon it was gone. Completely. Where there had once been a grand, polished entrance, there was now just an open stretch of road leading straight into the subdivision. No sign, no walls, no barrier, just access. And people noticed. Immediately, delivery trucks started cutting through instead of looping around. Drivers who'd never been there before followed their GPS straight in. Teenagers, probably bored out of their minds, realized it was now the easiest shortcut between two main roads. Within hours, what had been a controlled, curated entrance became just another open road. And that hit them harder than anything. By the next day, the complaints started rolling in. I didn't hear them directly, but word travels fast in places like that. Security concerns, traffic issues, people saying they didn't feel exclusive anymore. Which, if I'm being honest, was probably the point. Late that afternoon, Ethan showed up again. This time slower. No rushing. No shouting. Just walked up, hands in his pockets, and stopped a few feet away from me. We need to fix this, he said. I didn't respond. We'll move your fence back, he continued. Exactly where it was. I looked at him. That should have been the first thing you said, I replied. He nodded slightly. And we'll cover the cost. I shook my head. That's not enough. A pause. Then, what do you want? There it was. Finally. Not assumption. Not dismissal. A question. I let the silence sit for a second, not to be dramatic, but because I wanted to be sure. Because once this was said, it was set. I want a permanent easement agreement, I said. In writing. Monthly compensation. And full acknowledgement of the original boundary line. He didn't answer right away. Just studied me. Like he was recalculating everything. That's excessive, he said eventually. I shrugged. So was moving my fence. Another pause. Longer this time. Behind him, I could see cars still passing through that wide open entrance, people who had no idea any of this was happening, just taking advantage of what was there. And that was the pressure. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. We'll draw it up. It took a few days to finalize everything. Lawyers got involved. Documents went back and forth. But in the end, every word was signed. Every term agreed. They rebuilt my fence exactly where it belonged, not an inch off. Paid for new materials. Covered the taxes I'd been overpaying on that strip of land. And the entrance, they put it back. Smaller this time. Simpler. And legally, sitting on land they now had to pay to use. Every month. No handshake. No assumptions. Just ink on paper. These days, when I drive past it, it doesn't look nearly as impressive as it used to. Still nice, sure. But different. Because now I know what it actually is. Not a symbol of some polished community. Not a statement piece. Just something that exists because I allow it to. And that's 6 feet of land? Yeah, that's mine again. Now here's the thing I've thought about more than once since all this happened. Was I right to go that far? Some people would say I escalated it. That I could have handled it differently. Maybe. But here's what I keep coming back to. If someone can take a piece of what's yours without asking, and face no consequences, then what exactly stops them from taking more? So I'm curious what you think. Was it justified? Or did I take it too far? Let me know in the comments, because I guarantee, if you've ever dealt with neighbors, property lines, or an HOA that thinks they run the world, you've got an opinion on this one. And trust me, I'd like to hear it.